Okay, well, we're a minute after, so we'll go ahead and get started with our webinar today. I want to welcome you all and thank you for joining us. Today we're going to be talking about analyzing the effectiveness and equity of electric vehicle tax credits in the state of Georgia. My name is Mike Centettos. I'm the Policy Director for the National Center for Sustainable Transportation. I'll be moderating the webinar today. I'm just going to do a quick background before we get going. This is part of our webinar series that we sponsor here at the National Center for Sustainable Transportation. NCST is part of the University Transportation Centers program, which is administered by the U.S. Department of Transportation. And we're a consortium of 6 universities around the country focused on advancing environmentally sustainable transportation through cutting-edge research, direct policy engagement, and education of our future leaders. We also want to acknowledge the co-sponsorship of the Center for Transportation, Equity, Decisions, and Dollars, or CTED, which is a Tier 1 University Transportation Center led by University of Texas at Arlington. So today's webinar will last an hour. We'll have a presentation from Dr. Randy Gensler from the Georgia Institute of Technology. And then we're very happy to welcome a guest respondent, Ann Blair from the Electrification Coalition. And she'll be speaking following the presentation. And then we'll open up the floor for Q&A. So you have a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Feel free to put your questions in there at any time, and we'll do our best to answer all of them following the presentations. And we will be recording the webinar, and so the recording will be available with closed captioning on our website, along with the slides later in the week. So with that, let's go ahead and jump in. Dr. Randy Gensler is a professor of civil and environmental engineering at Georgia Tech. He's also an associate director for the National Center for Sustainable Transportation. And Randy, we're very happy to have you with us. I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you very much. So as Mike indicated, this is a research project that was sponsored by CTED. But in addition, it was sponsored by NCST because all of the modeling tools that you see applied in the research were developed with NCST. So glad that we're doing this joint webinar. Before I start, let me first acknowledge that this is primarily Hao Bing Liu's work. He has done an incredible job. He's a NCST alumni. He's now at the University of New Mexico. He's an assistant professor there. He has done fantastic work with NCST. In addition, he's been developing some excellent tools to go along with air mod dispersion modeling that you'll be hearing more about later in the semester. So with that, let me go ahead and talk a little bit about where we're headed here today. First off, we're looking backwards at the fact that federal and state income tax incentives have been offered for a lot of years, for decades, especially for plug-in electric vehicles. And the sales histories, you just look at the sales histories, it's pretty clear that there's a significant influence of the EV purchase incentives on the uptake of electric vehicles into the fleet, especially with respect to Georgia, because we had the largest state incentive. There was one other state incentive as well, but ours was special in a couple of ways that we'll talk about later in terms of the fact that it was allocated over 5 years, and it ended up being embedded into leases as well. And we had a lot of sales that were going on with the electric vehicles, especially the Nissan Leaf during that time period. And the unique experiment associated with the Georgia credit is that we offered it for a number of years and then we stopped. And so in 2015, we discontinued the incentive, and that gives us an opportunity to look at what happened in Georgia after the discontinuation of the incentive and to compare that to what's happened in other states. And the second part of this, so it's kind of like a two-part project. The second part of this is looking at, well, you've offered these incentives and it's an income tax credit, which goes against income tax that you owe. And the question is, well, how do those credits flow in terms of household income, race, and other factors? Is there kind of an equal opportunity access to the credit? Is the accessibility to these credits limited? Are there complexities in the tax codes that may affect your ability as a household to use these credits, both at the federal and the state levels? So as part of the research project for CTED, the stuff that you'll hear about later is examining the credit accessibility for the federal income tax credits and the state income tax credits in Georgia using household level income information, household level licensed demographic data from a marketing firm. And then I think, I haven't heard of TurboTax being used as a research tool before, but we sure did use it. We coded all of the income tax calculation methods into Python, and then we actually checked everything that we were using against TurboTax for verification, which is kind of a fun process. So in this research that we'll talk about today, we looked at standard deductions based on your filing status, the PEV credit, which is $7,500 at the federal level and whatever your state level is. And we look across other states besides Georgia as well. And then we also brought in the child tax credits, which do make a difference. And we'll see that later. So there's a lot of incentive to get PEVs into the fleet, plug-in electric vehicles, both the battery electric vehicles as well as plug-in hybrids. They are much more energy efficient, and that's including the life cycle analysis. And yes, we acknowledge that you have to produce the power at a power plant. You've got to transmit the electricity over the lines, and there are power losses in all of those processes. But if you look at everything from we say from well to wheel, going all the way from where the energy comes from, the distribution, the transformation, and then the use of the electricity at the road. The electric vehicles are a much more efficient prospect. They save a lot of energy. They're more efficient at the motor level. The production of the electricity is very efficient at the power plants. You have regenerative braking to recapture energy that you're losing at stopping at intersections and the like. So they're very energy efficient. And because of that, it's not quite a one-to-one correlation between energy use and CO2 emissions. You got to recognize other greenhouse gases and other components, but they go hand in hand. If you're saving energy, you're decreasing CO2 emissions. In addition, if you are burning less fuel, you're producing less emissions. And so even the criteria pollutants, the emissions are significantly reduced when you go to electric vehicles. That means cleaner air and a healthier environment that we're moving around in. So we have some benefits there from health impacts as well. So a lot of incentives. The problem is that still, as a technology emerges, the technology is more expensive. It takes some time to get to economies of scale. And so seeding the market with incentives is something that we've done a lot in the past with various technologies to get the marketplace started. And so that in part is what the PEV purchase incentives were all about at the federal level. The tax credits range from $2,500 to $7,500. And the full tax credit was available until 2,000 qualified EVs were sold by each US manufacturer. And you can see over on the right, we got a little bar chart that shows when the Tesla credit was cut in half, and there were a lot of Tesla sales going on, that the market declined a bit, and then it recovers. And so, there's no doubt, just looking at the charts, and if we just showed all the curves, you would see the relationship over time between the provision of the incentive. You can control for gasoline prices. You can control for a lot of factors, and in fact, that's what we're going to look at in this study is how do you control for these factors in an experiment or a quasi experiment to try to figure out what the influence of a specific credit was. So let's take a look quickly at the 23 states, or I'll just say there were 23 states. The report goes into the states and their individual credits. You got the federal tax credit, 23 states and DC that have offered purchase incentives over time. The federal, as I mentioned, $7,500 is the max for qualifying purchases. California, Oregon, DC, Louisiana, and others offered incentives. And Georgia's was the biggest. It was tied with another state. It's on a slide coming up. I don't remember which one off the top of my head. But $5,000 for purchasing that vehicle or leasing a qualified zero emissions vehicle. Now in Georgia, it had to be truly a zero emissions vehicle, not just an alternative fueled vehicle. It had to meet specific criteria. So we're really talking about the Nissan Leaf and Tesla and some of the other pure electric vehicles that were qualifying for the credit. But that's a big amount as a state credit. And like I said, we started offering that, and then that was discontinued in 2015, which gives us some time since 2015 to look at what's happened to vehicle sales, electric vehicle sales in Georgia since that time, and looking at what happened in other states as well. So if we look at the policy evaluation, you can look at it in terms of effectiveness, the number of induced EV sales or sales rates, sales per million capita in the state that hopefully are due to the incentive policy and not something else, not some other confounding factor. And then we can look at equity, whether the incentives have comparable accessibility to the public by income, race, and these other factors. So let's take a look first at the PEV purchase incentives, these federal and state tax credits, and look at the effectiveness using what's called a synthetic control method. Now, in an ideal experimental design, you've got your white mice and they're receiving some kind of a treatment, and you look at whether or not the treatment eliminates a disease or prevents you from getting a disease. We're all getting lots of experience with this right now. And then in the control group, you have hopefully the exact same white mice that you're controlling for, and the mice in a lot of these experiments are specifically genetically bred to be, a control group. They're genetically the same. And so then you can look at what happens when you don't give the treatment, how many of them develop the disease, how many of them do not develop the disease, or the disease is cleared. In this case, the graph is showing keeping the disease versus removing the disease. It's hard to reverse my mindset for the last 2 years, and now we're looking at how many get the disease versus how many do not get the disease with the vaccination programs we have in place. But you get the idea, right? We're looking at a treatment group and we're looking at a control group, and we want them to be identical. And the problem is that in the real world, when you have something that's going on, it's quite rare that we have a control group that's exactly the same as the treatment group. And we can compare those populations, but the question is, was it really the treatment, this vaccination or this treatment that we're giving, was it that caused the change, or was it something else we haven't controlled for? So the control group that you're choosing you want it to be as similar as possible to the treatment group. In this case, we're talking about weight, category size, genetic makeup, predispositions, resistance to or immunodeficiencies, all of those kinds of things. You want the control group to be the same as the treatment group. Now in Georgia, right, we can call us the Georgia mice. The Georgia mice were buying electric vehicles, and then all of a sudden, we're faced with a $5,000 income tax credit. And the question is, well, what happens? Do the Georgia mice change their behavior? And certainly we see a change in purchases of the vehicles. I'm going to hold off and show you that graph later on. But is this happening elsewhere? Is it some other factor? Did gasoline prices spike to $10 a gallon, and that's why people are buying electric vehicles? Or is it really associated with the income tax incentive? And the question is, what's our control group, right? All of Georgia, all the Georgia mice are being treated, right? And so, you don't have a control group with no incentives that you can compare against. And that's the dilemma. And so is it possible to kind of create a control Georgia? Is it possible to say, well, Georgia's very much like another state? Well, we're very much like South Carolina, or very much like Florida, or maybe we're not very much alike New Mexico. And what are the factors that you can bring into play that we can look at to say, all right, what would have happened in Georgia if the incentives had not been offered, so that we can compare what did happen in Georgia when the incentives were offered. And so if you look on the left over here, let's focus there for a minute and not worry about the equation on the right. Who are the control mice, right? Do we compare ourselves to California? Well, those California mice live in a very different environment, different policies, different experiences. So maybe comparing to California mice isn't a good idea. Those Texas mice, I've met a lot of Texas mice. They're pretty different than Georgia mice. New Mexico, I don't know. Well, we are very similar in terms of the environment that's around us as Florida. Maybe we have more younger mice. We got a lot of Georgia mice that have summer homes down in Texas or in Florida along the beach. So, there's some shared demographics, there's some shared policy, there's some shared environmental conditions. So maybe Florida is a reasonable comparison. But what's going on with synthetic control group analysis, or creating a synthetic control group, is saying, well, we're a lot like this state, we're somewhat like this state, we're a little bit like this state, we're nothing like these states over here. So can we create a control group that is essentially a weighted sum of these other groups and compare ourselves to them and see what would have happened if the incentives had not been offered in Georgia, excuse me. So what we're doing in the mathematical approach is we're trying to find the weighting factors that will control for differences in economic and sociodemographic features. that will, in the mathematical process, minimize the differences between observed and treatment weighted regional average sales during the non-incentive periods. In other words, after the incentive ends and we see what the sales are in Georgia and how they're moving, we're looking at, well, what's happening in Florida? What's happening in DC? What's happening in all these other states? And what are the various factors, economic factors, sociodemographic factors, policy factors, and other things that we can bring into the model that will help to explain why there's differences. In other words, we're trying to capture that variability and then create a set of weights to say that Georgia is very much like a combination of these states. And if the incentives had not been offered in Georgia, here's what we think would have happened. And so some of the factors that get brought into these analyses that are in the paper that's in peer review right now, the various models of the battery electric vehicles and plug-in hybrids that were available, public charging station availability, gasoline, electricity prices, urbanization, you see the list here. And the first thing you should recognize is, well, there's a lot that's missing, right? I mean, public charging station availability, does that make sense as a variable? Would we include it as a causal variable? Or is that an indication of something else that's going on? And, household income, urbanization, what are the factors? What are the real factors underlying these purchase decisions? And, we can take this kind of analysis to the extreme with machine learning, and we can say, well, we don't really care whether or not we're getting the right answer for the right reason. What we really want to know is how do we look at all these different variables and figure out what's going to happen next, irrespective of the reason. Just let the machines do all the crunching, let them figure out what's causing all the variability, and then let's look at what's going to happen in the next time step. Well, in kind of a similar thought process, there's a lot that's missing here. There's a lot that's intercorrelated here. And as you'll see in a minute, I'm going to make the case that it really doesn't make that much of a difference whether you have all the right factors involved, because all we really want to know at this point is, did the incentives make a difference? Yes, it's possible that we could be making a mistake and that we're missing something, but we're not really trying to ascribe a causality in the analysis we're doing. Similarly, if we go back and look at this equation, you can argue about what the penalty weights should be and the functional forms and all of that. And again, those are all nuances that we don't really need to worry about, because you're going to see in a minute that there's a huge difference. And we know that based on the results of this analysis, the incentives had to have made a difference. So if you look at how Georgia looks compared to these other states, and you go through the mathematical equations and you use the variables that we've selected, and we can argue all day about whether those variables are appropriate or if we should have used some additional variables and things like that. If you look at synthetic Georgia, it's composed of like 30% of what's going on in Florida, 20% of what's going on in North Carolina. We're a little bit like Kansas and Arizona, a tiny bit like Idaho, Wisconsin, and Oklahoma. California and Texas, they don't make the list. But in other words, what we're looking at is, what is synthetic Georgia? Well, it's a combination of these other states. When you apply the model and you look at the sales rates, this is what you get. Okay, and the red line here on the left is the signal. That's what we saw in Georgia. So that's the sales per million population. We have the yellow bar is indicating when the incentives were offered. And you've got the sales increasing. And not only can I make the case that it's a significant impact, you can also see that downturn in 2015 when the incentives were going to be canceled, and the uptick at the end when they said, no, the incentives are still good. It's really pretty clear. We don't need a fancy mathematical formula for us to figure out that the Georgia incentives made a difference, that the income tax credits were very effective. Now, if you follow the black line is what's predicted using the synthetic Georgia model that I showed a couple slides earlier. And that's a pretty good agreement. So again, let's not get lost in the nuances at this point of the functional form of the model or what variables are included. The bottom line is, if you compare this, if I just even showed you the sales for all of these other states, you can see that Georgia has this huge anomaly, and it has to be related to the tax credit. All right, here's some different estimations, synthetic control analysis applied in New York, Massachusetts, Vermont, and Delaware. Some work pretty well. Others not so well, but we got a big signal in Georgia that we were looking at, and it matches up quite well. All right, so let's take a look now. Let's assume at this point that the incentives do matter. And the question is, well, where do those incentives go in this system? And we're looking at the purchase incentives with respect to how they're recouped, which is through an income tax credit. And then after we look at who can get those credits, we'll look at how they're distributed in the state of Georgia. So as I mentioned, $7,500 income tax credit for the purchase, but you only get the full $7,500 if you owe $7,500 for your annual tax bill. And that, forget what you already paid and your withholding and all that. Your net bill at the end, what you owe, minus what you already paid, is what you still owe them. But the $7,500 only comes to you if you owe $7,500. If you only owe $5,000, you only get $5,000, and it's an all consumption in 1 year, as opposed to Georgia, which I mentioned before, is spread out over 5 years. And you'll see that makes a big difference in who gets to consume the credits. Then we have 7 states we looked at that implemented state income tax credits, and there's 2 types that we'll talk about in a minute as to how they implement their state taxes. And it does matter which group you're in. And just kind of in a similar fashion, the state income tax credit is against your state income tax liability. And so you can see here the ones we're looking at. You got Colorado and Georgia, both are $5,000. Ours began before January 2011 and ended in 2015. Colorado started in 2017. Louisiana, Montana, Oregon, and South Carolina, and Utah were the other ones that we looked at. And smaller credits down in the mid-range there, Montana, Oregon, and South Carolina. And you'll see how that plays out in some of the charts in a minute. So if we look at the consumption of the tax credit and we develop the equations that say, okay, here's your gross household income, your filing status, you're filing either a single, married, filing jointly, or head of household on the federal level, and that gives you a standard deduction. We didn't worry about the itemized deductions in these analyses for your charitable donations and the like, which just stick with the standard deductions. And then you can look at the tax tables, and here's what you owe. You owe this percent on this amount of income, and then a little higher percent on the next slice, et cetera. And you know how that works in your taxes. And it's different depending on your filing status. And then we look at, well, what's the impact of the income tax credit? But there's another nuance here, and that is the child tax credit, because it matters with respect to the way that the income tax credits for the PEVs have been implemented. Over on the left here, you've got the eligible credit that you have available, and then the percentage that we're going to use in the charts that flow are the amount that you were able to consume. So it's, you got the $7,500 credit, but if you could only take 5,000 of it, then you got 5,000 divided by 7,000 is your percentage that you were able to claim. And if you look at this across the income groups, so going from 10,000 household income up to 120,000 annual household income, and this is for US married couple, we have all of these charts for the different filing status. And there's nuances, they change a little bit. But what you can see here is that there's an interaction effect that's going on with the child tax credit based on the number of children that you have and your income. And so if you have 1 or 2 children, and you're up in the 100,000 to 120,000 range, you're going to get 100% of the tax credit. But as you move over to the end, you're not able to consume all of that income tax credit for the PEV because you got more credits for the child tax credit. So it does matter. A married couple with 2 children, income is $100,000, they get the whole credit. They get to consume all $7,500. But if you have an $80,000 income and 2 children, you only qualify for 68.5% of the credit. So there is a conflict that has gone on in this process. I don't know if we were all aware of this before. I was shocked. I didn't know that that was the case. So it was kind of a learning experience for me. All right, and then we'll look at the states here. And like I said, the paper has the report that I'll give you the citation at the end, has all these broken down by different groups. So let's look at 2 different states groups. We got Georgia, South Carolina, and Utah, where the state tax liability is independent of the federal tax liability. So your state taxes are calculated, and it doesn't matter what you paid in federal income tax. Then you've got these other states where the deduction that you get, in other words, you get a deduction in your state income level for what you paid in federal taxes. Let me try that again. For every dollar you paid in federal taxes, it counts, it's a deduction against what your gross is for your state. So you're getting credit for the amount that you paid in federal taxes. So think of it this way. If you get a $7,500 tax credit from the federal government, you're paying $7,500 less in federal taxes, and your state taxable income goes up by $7,500. So in other words, you're not going to get that full credit on your state level potentially because you're getting some of the money back from the feds, and that increases your gross for your state, and therefore you're going to have to pay more taxes on that. So the bottom line here is that it does matter whether you're over here in group 1 or you're over here in group 2. In the interest of time, I'm going to let you walk through these slides on your own, but you can see that what we've done in this process is we've taken the individual tax tables for each of the states and worked those out so that you get the standard deduction, and then we work that money back in. If you got that federal tax credit, it works back into the income, and therefore you pay a little bit higher state tax. And so therefore, just based on the tax rates and the tax rate structures, there's another thing to keep in mind, and that is states with lower state tax rates have higher income thresholds for state income tax credit eligibility. And so in Georgia, where we have a 6.75% tax rate now, you can actually get the full tax credit at the state level for a $24,000 income, whereas in South Carolina, $46,000, and in Utah, $31,000. So the bottom line, and it also matters whether you're single or married filing jointly. It's a nuance, right? It makes it more complicated to figure out what the impacts are across income groups and other demographic factors that might be associated with income. Remember that the tax schedules and your IRS reporting and your 1040s and all that, they don't care what race you are, they care what income you have. But as we'll see in a minute, income and race are highly correlated in Georgia. So high income households not fully eligible for the state PEV tax credit. That federal tax credit can give you up to a $7,500 decrease in the state deduction. And so we get this really strange looking chart here, especially from Montana, where if you take the federal tax credit and you're up in that upper left quadrant, you can actually have a slight increase in the percent of state taxes that you owe. So you get the credit at the federal level, and then if you claim that credit on your state taxes, you're going to actually end up paying more, slightly more, not a huge amount, but slightly more. You lose 3%. Whereas if you're over in this lower quadrant, you can get all of the state tax credit that's available. So you got to watch your taxes. 3% of $500, not a big deal. But it's the shape of this curve and the strangeness of this curve and the differences across these different states that are really, to me, they're kind of fascinating. So again, the report breaks those down and you can see all these kinds of charts across the different states. So if we look at accessibility in the metro Atlanta area, 62% of the households are not eligible for the full credit. So if you look at this graph down below, you got 10% to 30% are getting a small fraction of the credit. They can get up to 25%. And then you've got the next chunk where they're getting up to 50% of the credit. And the next chunk gets you to the full credit. The only folks that are getting the full credit are the folks above the line. So 100% minus 62% get the full credit. And 43% of the households are not eligible for 50% of the credit. There's significant race disparities then across these households. And again, this is using the licensed demographic data for the metro area where we look at the association between household income and race. And white families tend to get about 42% of those households will get full credit, whereas only 20% of Black and 29% of Hispanic households will get full credit, be able to consume the full credit. 57% of the Asian households and 39% of other. So again, shouldn't be too surprising. It just results from the correlation between race and income, but it certainly is an indication that we need to take a look at how the policy is playing out. And then with respect to the Georgia tax credit that expired in 2015, that $5,000 credit was spread over 5 years for deduction. So you didn't take it all at once. That means instead of having to take all 5,000 in year one, you only have to take 1,000. So if you owe more than 1,000, you're now eligible to take all of that 1,000 for that year. And there's quite a number of households out there that may owe a lot of taxes in 1 year and no taxes in the next year. And by spreading this tax credit out over 5 years, it turns out that we were able to get that tax credit into a lot more households based on eligibility. A higher percentage of the lower income households therefore qualify for the state tax credit than qualified for the federal tax credit. So 79% of the metro households would receive the full Georgia credit versus only 38% that would receive the full federal credit. So spreading that out over 5 years kind of makes sense. only 6% would be eligible to leave less than, or to get less than 25% of the Georgia tax credit, and all of those households earned less than $20,000 per year. And so from a big picture policy perspective, we ought to be thinking about that, but maybe it is the case that very low income households have some bigger things to worry about than whether or not they have an electric vehicle for use. So there's a lot of things, a lot of complexities in all of this. All right, so the Georgia incentives were also much more accessible by race because of this correlation. Full federal credit only by 20% of Black and 29% of Hispanic households, whereas the full credit can be attained by 65% of Black and 73% of Hispanic households in Georgia. So we think that multi-year federal credits will help to improve credit accessibility. All right, last topic here, and then I'll sum up. One of the goals of deploying electric vehicles into the fleet is to help reduce energy consumption and emissions. That improves health impacts, makes us less reliant on external energy sources, et cetera. And that is a function of how the how the fleet is currently distributed in these demographic groups, how the emission rates are distributed, so fuel economy, if you will, as well as the emission rates, and then how those vehicles are used, because the more the vehicle is used, the more opportunity you have to save energy. We're going to look only at the first two because figuring out how the vehicles are used by household requires a lot more invasive data collection than what we're able to do for this project. It can be done. It can be done based on inspection and maintenance records coupled with household demographic data, but there's a lot of approvals that have to be made before you can look at those kinds of levels. But these kind of findings can be taken into consideration in looking at future policies. This chart just shows you that we've made huge improvements in the emissions rates for motor vehicles. We've reduced emission rates by 90% over the last few decades, and the fuel economy has increased tremendously, and it's going to continue. So looking at replacing older high mileage, high annual mileage vehicles, and I'm not talking really old vehicles, but aged vehicles is probably where we want to prioritize. And this chart here is showing that, if you look at household income versus vehicle age, the older vehicles tend to be clustered in the lower income households. And over on the right, you're looking at, well, what is the contribution, the credit eligibility for these households based on kind of their emissions rates that they have going. And the bottom line, if you just look at the first chart there, the carbon monoxide emissions, the households that have 0 to 25% of the eligibility, they're producing 36% more CO in their vehicles than the households in the higher income groups in the 100% credit eligibility, if the vehicles are driven equivalently. And that's a nuance that's not presented here, but it's an area that we do need to focus on. So let me wrap up here and we'll go to the discussion. First off, the Georgia tax credits appear to be very effective. The synthetic control method does contain, in my opinion, enough control properties that we're getting the right answer. Yes, we can refine that. We can refine the modeling. We can refine the variables that are being used, but there's no doubt we're going to see that signal because there's nothing else that we can think of that can explain that. The income tax credits can only be used when taxes are owed. So low income households have less accessibility to those credits. The 1-year credit eligibility is a problem, especially with respect to the child tax credit and the fact that you have to consume that whole credit in 1 year. And that meant that 62% of Atlanta metro households were not eligible for the full credit. Because we spread the credit in Georgia over 5 years, you had a lot more accessibility. Because it was allowed to be used as in part with leasing over that same time period, you had a lot more people that took advantage of it. It made it so that you could lease a Nissan Leaf for a very, very low price per month. And I guess the last element here is that the state tax credits are a little bit complicated. We're not talking generally about huge tax incentives, but the way that the taxes are structured can be a little bit of a problem. And it's something we need to consider, especially if you have a state that's taking that federal refund and then saying that that's now income on the state side. And then I guess the last element here is that the lower income households drive older high emission vehicles. There's greater potential energy savings for those households that are accruing a lot of mileage. We certainly could, if we wanted to, do a combined incentive program where we're looking at the vehicles that are being retired, or the vehicles that are older, that are higher emitting, that are being used a lot, and try to target some of those vehicles for retirement. We're not talking about the old style scrap program where we're trying to buy cars out of existence, but in terms of providing additional incentives for those really high mileage households that are driving older cars, maybe that's an area we could focus. So with that, I'll let you take a look at this. We've got the effectiveness analysis that I talked about. It's a paper that's been submitted to energy policy, still in review. So we'll hopefully get that approved pretty soon. And then the equity analysis is actually the CTED report that's available. The link is here. You can download that report. You can see all of the fancier graphs. There's still a lot of work to do. We haven't looked at the 2021 child tax credits and how that works. We've got the alternative minimum tax, which is basically requiring that you pay more taxes depending on where you are. And then the earned income tax credit, which is essentially a refund whether or not you've paid taxes. We haven't worked into that as to how that plays out in all of this. And then in the next analyses, when we're looking at the energy and emissions benefits, we'll be taking a look at annual vehicle activity, provided that we can get approval to look a little bit deeper at the individual household data on the mileage accrual. That's needed for that kind of assessment, so that you can look at the household level demographic data coupled with VMT. All right, with that, I will stop sharing my screen.
All right, thanks, Randy.
Thanks.
Very informative presentation, and you not only took on a really complex modeling effort, but you also tackled the tax code. So I'm not sure which one is more impressive.
We couldn't have done it without TurboTax, I'll tell you.
So I did want to just pause real quick to do a clarification. We got a couple questions about that 5-year period over which Georgia residents could take the tax credit. And Anne just clarified in the chat that that could be taken in a single year if you have the tax liability, but you have the option of spreading it over 5 years.
Yeah, the carryover, right. Yeah, I've phrased that incorrectly.
So thank you. Okay, so I now want to turn to our guest respondent to get her take on these results and kind of EV incentive policy moving forward. So Anne Blair is Senior EV Policy Manager for the Electrification Coalition, which is a nonpartisan nonprofit group that develops and implements strategies to support EV adoption across the US. And she's also worked at the Southeast Energy Efficiency Alliance and the Southern Alliance for Clean Energy. So she's been working on EV policy in the Southeast for quite some time. So Anne, we're really thrilled to have you join us, and I'll turn it over to you for a few minutes.
Great. Thank you so much, and good afternoon to everyone. And thank you to the National Center for Sustainable Transportation for inviting me and the opportunity to join you all today. As he mentioned, I am Anne Blair, Policy Manager at the Electrification Coalition, and I have been engaged in electric transportation policy in the Southeast since about a year or so before the Nissan Leaf was released in late 2010. And I also serve as president of EV Club of the South, which is a car club here in Metro Atlanta that's been around since the late 90s, since the EV1 was a big thing. I wanted to share a little additional context with you about the Georgia tax credit story and kind of more of the political story, and then share with you a little bit more on policy opportunities that we see moving forward. Surprisingly, Georgia ended up in this very unique position for EV expansion, and really without even knowing it. Georgia had had a tax credit on the books since the late 90s, and then it was increased to the $5,000 level in the early 2000s. So this was well before it was fully recognized that EVs really were the future, and that's where we were headed. So when the Nissan Leaf came out in late 2010 and really began to be adopted in 2011, along with the tax credit already being on the books, plus the fact that Atlantans drive a whole lot, and we need to, just due to some of the restraints of our transit system, EV sales really did take off. It really was the perfect storm of things coming together. So by, over the next couple of years, Georgia, became a leader in EV sales. And in just 2 years, we became the state with #1 in Nissan Leaf sales and #2 nationally, only behind California. But with this growth in national recognition, it also began setting off alarm bells to our decision makers, because the state was now crediting millions of dollars that they had previously not accounted for. There was not a full understanding of the popularity of the Nissan Leaf with the tax credit. So it was about 2 years after the credit started really being used, so around 2013, that efforts began to attempt to repeal the credit in the Georgia legislature. So in response, a coalition of groups, including myself, the organization I was working for, as well as the car clubs and some of the university representatives and others, began to come together to see if we could come up with alternatives. Because the tax credit, as Dr. Gensler mentioned, it was a very generous tax credit compared to many others at $5,000. It could be used for both the lease and the purchase of vehicles. So it's, fairly unique in that way. And we were able to hold off repeal for a couple of years. And by that time, we had more than 40,000 electric vehicles in Georgia, which was more than most other states still have today, with the exception of a few. Unfortunately, the alternative bills that were proposed did not move. And then in 2015, a large transportation bill was being considered, which was a big priority for the governor at the time. This would have supported additional transit in the state, as well as a lot of other mechanisms. And the repeal provision of the tax credit got included in that bill. And so ultimately it met its demise, despite many folks who did support the tax credit, just because it was incorporated in this larger package that was very much a priority. So just wanted to share a little bit more, of that context with you. But, as was mentioned, in the presentation, these tax credits are proven to be effective policy. They're simple to implement and administer. They're pretty easy for us to implement. And it's especially good for new technology in the market and for the concentration of EVs in Georgia was and has since been primarily in the 5 counties right around Metro Atlanta. We've seen some shifts over the past few years, but that growth has been somewhat slow. The selection of vehicles, as well as the overall purchase price of EVs, even with the credit, is off limits to many people. And one of our goals is that we want every person to have access to some form of electrified transportation at affordable prices. Individual cars, or that could be electric buses and other things. And so that's some of the things that we're working on. But in regards to continuing support for light duty adoption, we see a lot of opportunities for additional change. We do think that Georgia should reconsider additional purchase incentives, including perhaps a lower tax credit, but it should also include some sort of point of sale or purchase rebates that would be applicable to lower income individuals. And we also need policies that will increase the vehicle model availability, both in terms of the price point, as I mentioned, and vehicle type. So we really want to see those car manufacturers move a bit faster. And one evidence of the importance of vehicle options is that when the Tesla Model 3 came out, that was what Tesla had advertised as, their car for every person. That was the first time that we began to see an increase in EVs since the repeal of the credit. So we knew that vehicle choice really does matter as well. There are a lot of new vehicles that are coming to market, both from traditional manufacturers as well as new companies, that would enable for increased adoption and appeal to a larger access of individuals. One of the key policies that we're recommending to help with that, and particularly in Georgia, is a direct sales legislation. Currently, Georgia does not allow for direct sales for vehicles. Tesla does have a small exception, but that current law requires that only franchise dealers sell the vehicles and that car makers cannot do that directly. We also need some other mechanisms. I know many of you on the phone today are from California. Many states have adopted California's LEV and ZEV standards, the zero emissions vehicle standards. What this policy does is it signals to manufacturers the potential demand for more vehicle model adoption, and more so than to making those available more to those states than to those who have not adopted the policy. So states like Georgia really are missing out by not adopting policies like that, because we're not getting the vehicle options. So I think California, you all have, more than double the number of available electric vehicles for sale than are available here in Georgia. I also wanted to point out that there were some other factors in addition to the tax credit repeal that we still don't know what the impact was. And, I'm so grateful for this research, because it really showed us what we were seeing on the ground with vehicles and who was driving them and where it was happening. That to actually have some data to back that up is really important. But also, at the time that the tax credit was repealed, a new user fee was also added at the very same time. And so now, if you have an electric vehicle, you pay somewhere around $212 to $214 annually for your EV. And that can be very punitive for more low and middle income individuals than for your typical early adopters. So that's just another factor. And I would be interested, Dr. Gensler, if you all took that into account in any way during the Q&A. But I just want to share one more thing kind of as a final note. As you all, if you've been paying attention to the news at all, there's many proposals for electric transportation in the Federal Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, and also in the budget resolution that's being considered in Congress right now. And we think that federal support is critical to making electrification more equitable and to really get more vehicles out on the road. Congress has an opportunity to really lead the way for expedited electrification for all sectors, including commercial goods transport, as well as for transit and school buses, so that the heavy duty vehicles also, we believe, need to be electrified as soon as possible. Incentives can help accelerate that demand. So we definitely want to see the federal tax credit considered, expanded, and uncut caps from those who've already been met their caps, such as Tesla and GM. We also would like to see additional tax credits for medium and heavy duty markets, and the expansion of programs like the Diesel Emissions Reduction Act and the Congestion Mitigation and Air Quality, or the CMAQ program, and direct support for state and municipalities to electrify their fleets. We truly believe that it is a crucial and pivotal time for electric vehicle technology and supply chain maturation. And these types of programs can reduce emissions from some of the greatest sources that are affecting our communities. Low-income communities and communities of color bear most of the burden of air pollution. And so getting more individuals in electric vehicles, whether that's a truck, bus, or an individual car or ride share, is critically important. So that's all the comments I had for right now. I did want to say that the Electrification Coalition works on policy, but we also have tools as well to help fleets transition. And just today, we released a new report on electrifying the federal fleet, and want to share that is available at electrificationcoalition.org/fed fleets. And I'll put that in the chat as well, but happy to take any of your questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anne. Really helpful kind of context and history, as well as your thoughts on policy. So we're going to transition into our Q&A now. We have some really good questions, and I'm going to do my best to maybe batch a couple of them so we can get to as many as possible. But Anne, in your remarks, you talked about point of sale rebates versus kind of this tax credit that you can get at the end of the year, the following year. Can you talk, or either of you, can you talk a little bit about the kind of the relative benefits and why you're advocating for that type of incentive instead?
Sure. Well, I think it, goes to the, as I was mentioning, it would be accessible to more people more quickly as well, and help lower that upfront cost of the vehicles. EVs, whether you're talking about, our cars that we drive or the heavy duty vehicles, they still are at a premium to conventional vehicles of the same type and size. Now, we would certainly argue as EV advocates that the technology is way better. So you you do get what you pay for, but they're still at a premium, and we need more vehicle options as well. We need the trucks, we need more SUVs of this type to appeal to a greater group of people. But we aren't expecting the battery cost makes up the largest part of the cost of an electric vehicle, and those prices have been coming down rapidly, but are not expected to reach parity with conventional or internal combustion engines until around 2025. And so, right now is a pivotal time to get more people in EVs quicker from a emissions and oil use perspective. And so those purchase incentives, on the hood rebates at the dealers at the point of sale would go a long way to helping reduce the costs for individuals.
Thank you.
I can add a little bit to that.
Oh, sure.
Because yeah, Ann mentioned that, we have this kind of a punitive fee now that goes along with an electric vehicle. The bottom line is that the EVs are not purchasing gasoline, so they're not paying road tax dollars. And so therefore, the legislature decided that there needs to be an annual fee for electric vehicles. There's another element, though, that also changed, and that was the structure of the ad valorem tax and the sales tax. So your annual registration for your new vehicles used to be based on the vehicle value. And so you paid a lot in that first year for your registration fee because this tax was added onto it. And then that declined until, the point where if you have a 1964 Comet sitting in your driveway, maybe it's $35 a year. But, for my brand new car, it's going to be $700. So they leveled that and changed the tax structure so you're essentially paying the equivalent up front, not exactly the same. And that is another disincentive to purchasing a brand new vehicle when you have to pay that all up front. And so that, I think, leads to the potential for these upfront rebates associated with the sales tax, where you don't have to base it on income, it's based on the purchase. So I think there's an opportunity there as well. We can argue about what's the fair a dollar amount that an electric vehicle user should pay because they are using the roadway. But I do think that, the fact that we've gotten rid of the ad valorem tax and front loaded a lot of that makes for an opportunity for change.
That response, I think, segues into a question we got, which is like just the kind of complexity of the tax code and some of these tax credits, and folks looking to buy a vehicle but maybe not knowing what their tax burden is going to be until the end of the year, and so they won't know kind of how much of that credit they can recover. And I'd be curious for both of your thoughts on whether that acts as a deterrent, that kind of uncertainty, or whether maybe buyers are just seeing that upfront number of the $7,500 federal tax credit, for example, and maybe not thinking about what their actual tax liability might be in purchasing the car. So curious both your thoughts on how those complexities of the tax code that Randy, you talked about might affect buyers' decisions.
I haven't seen any surveys with respect to, after the purchase, were you surprised? But, the fact that folks who had more children at the same income level are getting less of a rebate, that's kind of counterproductive. In general, those households with more people are driving more miles. It seems like that's where we would want to target. So I would just anecdotally expect that there are a lot of people out there who are probably surprised that they weren't eligible for the entire credit after they purchased it. But there's no planning website that I've seen that allows you to kind of tinker with, here's my income, here's the number of children that I have, and so what, will I be able to get the entire credit? And that might be worthwhile having.
Yeah, I would agree that that information was, very surprising. And I don't think, folks aren't looking at that stuff up. They are seeing that there's just the 7,500 numbers for federal, and what was 5,000 for Georgia. And so, yeah, that nuance is very interesting, but I don't think, and somebody asked it in the chat, I don't know, in terms of the tax credit driving additional EV adoption, I think that purpose was achieved, but in terms of, the other impact, I think we really need to look more strategically at that in terms of, how these policies are deployed and being affected by other credits as well. So
I think a lot of us figure this out about April 12th of the tax year, when we're trying to get those taxes filed before we really see what happened.
So, Randy, you had talked about the federal tax credit being far less accessible for households with lower income and minority race households. I'm curious, maybe a question for both of you, just in terms of, and the Georgia tax credit seemed like it performed better. Are there other incentives or other policies that either of you have come across or maybe advocated for to try to make electric vehicles more accessible to underserved communities? And just curious about kind of your thinking in that realm, and kind of you've been working with advocacy groups, kind of representing some of those communities, and kind of what you've seen or what you're thinking about.
I can jump in. Some of the things that we've been working on have been directly tied to utility electric transportation programs. So as utilities are looking at their opportunities to deploy charging infrastructure, what are some of the provisions to make sure that either their education outreach programs, or how heavy duty vehicles are being deployed in certain communities, and or where charging infrastructure is deployed, is that they are considering where some of the largest impact areas are, both in terms of emissions, as well as looking for access issues. Well, we do need to grow both these things together, charging infrastructure and vehicles. And so we want to make sure if we are identifying a need area to put charging infrastructure, well, we also need to consider, well, how do we also get somebody in that community, wherever it is, ensure that they have access to a vehicle. We don't want to just deploy charging infrastructure in areas without having the folks in those communities have access to those vehicles. So how do you really marry those things properly? So those are a lot of questions. I don't know that we're still figuring out a lot of the answers. So, research like this is really, helpful and helping those of us who are trying to inform policy on it. I would say, one of the things that we've seen made a big difference, less policy and more just education and outreach, is we are working with many more community groups right now, including the national organization EV Hybrid Noir, that's doing direct outreach to communities of color and low-income communities to make sure more folks know about the availability of the options, because there's a lot of influence by, seeing your neighbor driving an electric vehicle. That's shown one of the most effective ways to get people in vehicles, and you want to see people who look like you and, live like you, that has a big influence on adoption as well.
Yeah, you do see neighborhood clusters of purchases, and the dealerships were also very savvy in Georgia. They know each other, they talk to each other. They really did leverage the incentives that were there. I think that the supportive technologies, like Ann was mentioning, are really important to be able to support the placement of charging. It doesn't necessarily have to be public charging station either. It can be, within the universities, within the big business parks and the like. So it doesn't have to be public, in terms of public space. It can be within private space to provide for those commutes. But the bottom line is our commutes are not that long, and most of us can make 85% of our trips can be made with electric vehicles, especially in multi-vehicle households where you can switch off. So it just takes a lot more experience. And I think that looking at what other people are doing and seeing what your neighbors are doing and talking with them about the experience is something that just kind of helps the market take off. So the more we seed, I think the more we'll get in terms of adoption.
We had a couple of really good questions just come in, and we're kind of out of time. But Randy, just maybe real quick, we did get a question early on about whether the data is available that you use for other researchers to use, and maybe whether folks
sure.
can get in touch with you.
Yeah, just get in touch with us. The CTED, the report is available through there, and then there's a data management process that provides the data that are used for all the tax calculations and that. But all the graphics and charts and that you see, you can replicate in TurboTax too. So yes, just contact me, and I'll bring it over to Hao Bing at University of New Mexico, and all the data that populate those charts, those are accessible. They're all outlined in the report where they all came from. The vast majority of it is all public. The calculations are the things where the Python code was generated, and that can be shared with anybody who wants it.
Great. Well, we are at the hour. I really want to thank everyone who participated and for asking some really great questions. And of course, Randy and to you as well for your time and expertise. Really informative for me. So I really appreciate you taking the time. Folks can fill out the survey that'll pop up when they close down the webinar platform if you have any feedback for us, and keep an eye out for the next webinar coming up in a couple of months here. So thanks, everyone.